Hello, this is a transatlantic interview, lunchtime here in the UK, but only early morning in Pennsylvania in the United States. I'm in conversation with Professor Don Kraybill, a Mennonite scholar who wrote a key book which was incredibly influential in my life, The Upside Down Kingdom. Don's been an influence in two ways. His book challenged me to go in a different direction, but he also taught me sociology when I spent a year at an American Bible college. And this altered my understanding of power and management. And I'm absolutely delighted to see Don again. It's been a long time. Don, it's 35 years, I think, since we met. So it's good to see you.
Yes, I'm delighted to have this conversation and see you again, Simon. It's been a long, long time.
I don't know if you remember, it was quite a short time. You were at AMBS, but it's made, we'll go into it. It's made a big difference to my life. So,
well, it's fascinating for teachers to learn later that somebody was actually paying attention in class.
Yes, the worry you discover things you said.
Yes.
Okay, well, Don, let's go into start about your life and work through your life, but I may also take the opportunity to explore interesting things that come up, if that's okay.
Feel free to ask any questions you want to.
Okay.
If I don't know the answer or don't have an answer, I'll just say so.
Okay, great. Well, let's start with, what's your job title now?
I'm actually retired, so I'm a professor at Elizabethtown College, Emeritus, and also Senior Fellow Emeritus at the Young Center for the Study of Anabaptist and Pietist Groups. It's a research center at Elizabethtown College that I helped to start in 1989. And so I still go into the office, but now I can do whatever I want to. I don't have to show up to special meetings and that sort of thing. So it's a delight to be able to be in this stage and season of my life.
That's great. And Elizabethtown, can you just say where that is? And
yes, Elizabethtown College is in southeastern Pennsylvania. It would be about 2 hours west of Philadelphia, and it's about 30 minutes east of the state capital at Harrisburg. So it's basically southeastern Pennsylvania, and it's in the heart of the area where Mennonites and Amish came in the early 18th century and settled. So I feel right at home here. Elizabethtown College is a small private liberal arts college. We have about 1,500 students, and it was established in 1899 by the Church of the Brethren, which is another Anabaptist group we can talk about perhaps if you'd like at some point.
I think we will come into a bit about this just a bit later. So thank you.
Yes.
Can you say just when you were born and where you were born and a little bit about your family background?
Yes. Oddly, I was born about 6 miles away from where my home is now, 6 miles east of Elizabethtown, a little smaller town called Mount Joy. And I was born there in 1945. Shortly after the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And my parents were farmers. They were part of the local Mount Joy Mennonite church. So I grew up as a farm boy and was very much part of traditional Mennonite culture at that point. And we didn't own land, we were sharecroppers, and we moved, we lived in 6 different houses between the time I was born and the time I was 16. And so we were moving partly because we didn't have enough money to buy a farm. And if you were a sharecropper, if the owner's daughter got married and you had to move on because she wanted to farm, perhaps. So anyway, I grew up in that Mennonite farming culture in the late 40s and early 50s.
Okay. Did you feel you were a hard up family?
Excuse me?
Did your family feel like it was hard up? It didn't have a lot of money?
Yeah, I felt we weren't poor, but we depended on the milk check once a month to kind of, we had dairy cows. We also raised tobacco, and the tobacco was a kind of required crop to be raised if you were a sharecropper living on farms. So we weren't in poverty, but I felt like we were lower class farming, so to speak. It was a big source of unhappiness for my father because he wanted to buy a farm. All of his friends had farms, but his family didn't have a lot of financial resources. His father was a Mennonite minister, and Mennonite ministers serve voluntarily without pay. I mean, they don't get any compensation. And so eventually, after I was married and I was about 30 years old, my father was actually able to purchase a farm that he was renting at that point. So that was a big accomplishment for him.
Right. And your mother's background, was that a similar background?
Yes, actually, both my mother and my father came out of the Mennonite tradition, and we can trace their ancestors back to Germany and Switzerland. So, and so she was in a similar way out of the same. I mean, in an identical way. Just she lived a few miles away from where my father grew up. I would say the thing that was characteristic of us, I felt a sense of separation from the world, that we were in a community that wasn't part of the world. For example, we didn't have television. And one of my mother's brothers left a Mennonite church and he got television. And so when I was 7 or 8 years old, we'd go to my uncle's home, and he loved to watch the baseball games. The Philadelphia Phillies were playing. But beer commercials came on, he had to go up and turn the telly off. We didn't have any, remote control things. But my mother said that she let him permit me to watch as long as he would turn the television off when the beer commercials came on. So I had a sense, and we never had a television in my home ever as I was growing up.
Right.
Just another example, the separation from the world. We didn't have a Christmas tree, that we decorated, and didn't have Christmas lights in our house. And I said to my mother, well, why don't we have Christmas lights outside? She said, well, Jesus is the light of our life, and the light of Jesus is what shines bright in our lives. And it shows that we are different from other people, and we're like a city set a light on a hill that you can see that way instead of Christmas tree ornaments and so on. But it was a good life. I had a good family. I feel extremely fortunate to have won the ovarian lottery, so to speak, and to be born into a family that cared for me and loved me. And I'm very grateful for that.
Okay, yeah. There's several things you're saying here, which I think we want to come back to. Which is great. You were clearly brought up as a Christian in a very devout family. Was there a
Yes.
time you felt you had to choose a Christian life for yourself?
Yes, I have mixed feelings about it. I was baptized when I was 8 years of age, and I don't think I understood at that point completely what I was doing. I'm not quite sure. I don't remember the decision. I don't even remember being baptized. And then about 8 years later, when I would have been not quite that. I would have been 14 or 15. I was in public high school, and we had a youth organization called Youth for Christ. It was very evangelical and active in our area and in the high school. And for some reason, I was elected president, and it created a kind of spiritual crisis for me, because I had this sense that, well, I have to get really serious about my Christian life if I'm going to be president of this local chapter. And I would say that was more of a conversion experience for me as a young person, more so than my baptism at 8 years of age. I do remember, and I think my baptism I may have become part of that just because of the fear. It was the McCarthy era here in the United States. This would have been 1953. And I remember getting awake at night and running over to my parents. I was probably, I don't know if it was exactly when I was 8, but hearing the Russian troops coming in a dream. I had this nightmare that they were coming to get us. I hear their feet, could still hear their feet, pounding on the pavement as they were coming. I was frightened. And but it was the McCarthy era, anti-Soviet era. Again, it's 1952, 53. But that, I think I was anxious about that, and also had a clear sense that if I wasn't baptized, I would go to hell. That, I mean, it was Mennonite teaching at that point had a strong sense of, heaven and hell in a literal sense. And to an 8-year-old child, that's pretty scary stuff.
Yes. I mean, that's very interesting. We'll, again, also, I want to explore a bit more about your thinking about conversion as we go on.
And let me just say, I don't have any angry feelings about that. I mean, I feel the church, everybody cared about me, and so I don't have anger about it. It's just, it wasn't a real adult conversion.
Yes, and I'm also interested in your grandparents and parents. Did any of them have to face conscription in the First World War or the Second World War? Your father must have been about the age.
Yeah,
where
my father faced conscription in the Second World War, and he got a farm deferment. See, at that point, if you were on a farm, farming and production of food was considered a national priority because of the war. So he was called to the draft board, and he said he appealed for a farm deferment, and he had to provide evidence. I have the listing, the letter that he and my grandfather, he was working for my mother's father at that point on the farm. And this is right before he was married in 43. So this would have been about 40, 41. So he got a farm deferment. I mean, that would have applied to conscientious objectors and anyone who was farming. So it was, if that had been turned down, then he probably would have appealed as a conscientious objector.
Yeah. Okay.
So another way to say it is there were a lot of Mennonite boys at that point across the country who didn't live on farms. So they went into what was eventually called civilian public service. And this was set up by the Quakers and the Mennonites and the Brethren in the late 1930s, right as World War II was beginning. It became a national program funded by the churches, where young men would have to go to they'd work as forest rangers, or they'd work in mental health hospitals, they'd work in various types of activities that contributed to the national good and the national welfare in lieu of being in military service.
Right. Maybe this is a good moment, Don, for you to just outline a bit more about Anabaptists and the different strands of Anabaptism. I think an English audience probably doesn't have a very good idea about any of this.
Well, let me ask you a question about this first. One part of the question, or one thing I'd like to do at some point, is talk about the origin of the Anabaptists in Germany.
Yeah.
And then there's a separate question of who are they today? And I mean, what are the groups that came? So I guess, where would you like me to start, or do you want to handle those as two different questions?
Well, I think if you could talk a little bit about just where the Anabaptists came from. I think particularly I'm interested in their sort of theology, what they brought.
Right. Well, let me Let me
Go on.
talk about the origin, and then I'm happy to talk about the groups that came out of them, okay? So the context is Germany and the Protestant Reformation in 1517. And as that began in the Lutheran context, it also emerged in Switzerland and Zurich in the Reformed context. The Calvin, who gave impetus to the theological thinking of the Swiss Reformation, that was happening in Zurich, and that's where the Anabaptists got started, in Zurich, Switzerland. Zwingli was the lead pastor at the Zurich church, and he was more progressive than Luther. And he had students, young students, who were about to become Anabaptists in his classes, his theology classes. And they were studying the humanities, they were studying the classics, they were reading in Latin and Greek and so on. But they became impatient with the speed of the Reformation and the scope of it. And they got focused on adult baptism and pushed Zwingli on that. And he said he agrees with them basically on the value of voluntarism in the church and adult baptism. But he said, we have to go to the Zurich City Council and get their approval. Well, of course, they turned it down. Because at that point, if you were christened as a child in the church, you became a member of the church, you became a citizen, you went on the tax rolls, and you were on the list for conscription in terms of military fighting. So the Zurich City Council turned it down, and then they started they were young university students, and they were soon joined by many others, who refused to christen their children and also rebaptized themselves. And when I say rebaptized, they were baptized as an infant. Now that's where the word Anabaptist comes from, meaning twice baptized or baptized again. And so one of the key issues was voluntarism in religion, or the Believers Church, or the focus was on adult baptism. So that is a really important idea that persisted even and has influenced, I think, American religious thinking. The second thing that happened was because the Zurich City Council turned the young Anabaptists down, they said, well, the city council should not have jurisdiction over Christian faith in our religion. There should be a separation, and the Bible's our authority, Jesus is our authority. So that was the second really important idea of the separation of church and state. A lot of people don't understand it. Like if you take Switzerland, for example, I think there are 13 cantons, and 6 or 7 of those remain Catholic. The others were Reformed. But in each one, church and state were still together. Like the ones, of course, church and state were together. And in the Reformed ones, church and state were still together. If your prince that was ahead of a certain canton or territory, he would declare what the faith would be there in cooperation with the bishop. So separation of a church and state is a second really important idea that came forward. And is still, it had enormous influence here in the United States. Third thing is pacifism and peacemaking. Many of the Anabaptists, thousands of them, were persecuted and died, burned at the stake, decapitated, tortured in many different ways. But often they would ask for forgiveness when they're at the stake to be burned, asking and pleading for forgiveness for their tormentors. So you have this sense of forgiveness and peace woven into the fabric of the Anabaptist beginnings in Zurich. And finally, the focus on Jesus and the Gospels and the Sermon on the Mount were central. It's what we have often referred to as orthopractice. It's like the key Anabaptist question theologically is, what does it mean to follow Jesus daily in life? What does it mean to follow Jesus daily in life? That's the central Christocentric question of the Anabaptist tradition. Not what the creed is, not what the rituals are, not what the church fathers have said historically, but what does it mean today to follow Jesus daily in life? Anyway, that's a long,
Yeah.
a long journey. But those ideas, I would say, are three important earmarks of the Anabaptist tradition, not only then, but today as well. And obviously, different local congregations answer that question differently. And so they're not uniform, but they're still focused on practice, and particularly the Sermon on the Mount. And what does it mean to love our neighbor, to love our enemy, and the central teachings of Jesus found particularly in Matthew and Luke.
Yes. It was actually some of the history of the Anabaptists that made me come to a Mennonite Bible college, because I think the history is so extraordinary. So, and the author practice. Thank you. And just, Don, if you briefly, just could you distinguish between Amish, Mennonites, Brethren?
Yes. Yes, I'll do it as quickly as I can. It's a little complicated,
Yeah.
but so in Switzerland, the Anabaptists were known as Swiss Brethren. Eventually, they became known as Mennonites later in the Reformation. And the Swiss Brethren are one group from 1525 up to 1693. For 170 years, the Swiss Brethren are one group. In 1693, they have a division between the Mennonite side and the Amish. They go in two different directions and they branch off. So the Amish and Mennonites, another way to say it, share 170 years of history in Switzerland from 1525 to 1693. And after that, then they go separate ways. The Amish took on more conservative things in some ways. And the Amish, interestingly, also borrowed some things from Pietism that was emerging at the same time. So Mennonites have sometimes looked down on the Amish and sort of like, well, why did they become so conservative or whatever? And yet, some of the ideas from Pietism, the Amish were adopting and incorporating. So after 1693, they go separate ways. They migrate to America, to North America, as separate groups, but often live close to each other in similar communities. So the third group coming out of the Swiss Anabaptist movement are the Hutterites, named for Jacob Hutter, excuse me. And they form in 1527. They pull out from the other Swiss brethren over the issue of common goods and common property. And they went back to Acts in the New Testament, where everything was shared in common, and argued that that should be the standard. That's what, for them, it means to follow Jesus in daily life, to share things. And so they went to Austria, and then eventually came to the United States. Later, actually, they come in the late 19th century. And today there are 500 Hutterite colonies in various parts of the plains in the United States, and 2/3 of them are in Canada. And they still have common property. They don't get a paycheck. They are assigned work. They live in this colony together. They use high technology, much more high technology than the Amish, but they have a common treasury, so to speak. And so that's the third group. The fourth group are the Brethren, and the word Brethren is really complicated because there are dozens of different groups that call themselves Brethren in one way or another. But in 1708 in Schwarzenau, Germany, the German Baptist Brethren form, and they are coming out of radical pietism in the Lutheran tradition. Okay, and this is now this is 80 years away from the Protestant Reformation. So the radical pietists, and actually pietism itself there begins about 1675. The radical pietists move outside the church, and they are critical. It's a new Reformation, but it's a Reformation inside the Lutheran Church. The radical ones go outside. The churchly pietists stay in and try to do reform inside the church. And these radical pietists, some of them began baptizing adults, and Alexander Mack was the leader in 1708, and they became known as the German Baptist Brethren. They come to the United States, and they come in the 1720s and so on, about that time, to the United States. And then in 1908, they changed their name to Church of the Brethren. Mm-hmm. So, and the Church of the Brethren is the group that started Elizabethtown College, okay? And so they became one of the historic peace churches. I had said earlier about the historic peace churches had started civilian public service. It was the Brethren, the Mennonites, and the Quakers. The Amish benefited from that, but they weren't in the leadership of it. Right. So that's a quick overview. The Moravians, I think, the other side, asking about the Moravians one time, they are pre-Reformation. They're like 75 years or so before the Reformation. And there's not a connection between the Moravians and the Anabaptists. When they come here to North America, then the Brethren make more connections with them actually than the Mennonites.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Don. And you're embedded in this great tradition, this historical tradition, this sense of a people as well as a faith.
Yes.
Were you also impacted by any of the external movements? You know, we're talking about the 60s and 70s. You were obviously Youth for Christ influenced you.
Right.
Did any other external
that I would have been influenced by? Yeah, I would say, okay, let me just think. That's an interesting question. I would answer it by saying, in terms of college, I went to a public university here for 2 years in Millersville in southeastern Pennsylvania. Then for my last 2 years of undergraduate, I went to Eastern Mennonite College, now Eastern Mennonite University. And I graduated from there in 67. I went there 65 to 67. When I went there, the full gospel Pentecostal movement was strong, was really emerging in the United States. And there was a special emphasis. There was one group called Full Gospel Businessmen. They would get together and have conventions, and the focus was on speaking in tongues and the Spirit and so on. And my roommate at Easter, in my roommate in my junior year, he was he was a Mennonite, but very into the Pentecostal movement in the Mennonite church at that point. So he would pray in tongues, and I went to some of the meetings. I went to Washington to a meeting, and I would say I didn't know what to do with it. I felt like I wasn't pious enough. I felt like I wasn't religious enough. I couldn't learn to speak in tongues. It never happened. And, I finally kind of gave up and sort of, so it wasn't really a rejection of it. It just always made me feel like I wasn't pious enough, to be close enough to God to be able to feel the Spirit. I don't know. I wasn't agnostic at that point. I mean, I was leader of the student body church. We had a church service every Sunday evening, and I was the leader of that. And at that point, I was also got a very heavy dose of Anabaptism from one of my mentors, which was Myron Augsburger, who was president then. He came the same year I did as president. When I came as a junior, he came as president. He was a young, probably 36, 37-year-old president. He was studying Felix Manz, the first martyr that was killed in the Anabaptist movement. He was very much into Anabaptist theology, did his dissertation on Manz. And so I took some seminary courses with him while I was a senior at the college. And so he really influenced, he was a heavy, he was a heavy counterbalance to the Pentecostal things I was doing. But I never had a negative feeling toward the Pentecostal movement. It's just, I couldn't, at that stage, I mean, I have different thoughts about it now, but at that stage, so I can't say that I was ever really, the influences that I felt later were not particularly from, in graduate school, I felt more outside influences that were more academic and non-religious in terms of the people, you know, the scholars I was reading historically, like Marx and Max Weber and so on.
Right. And you also faced conscription yourself. It was the Vietnam War.
Yes.
And you refused to fight. Can you talk us through what happened?
Yeah, that was a very difficult time. I mean, the Vietnam War was a tumultuous time here in the United States. And I had a first cousin who burned his draft card. I had friends that went to Canada to get away from it. I didn't, they were more challenging selective service. And I wasn't as, what should I say, radical as they were. I was, I clearly knew I was a conscientious objector. And so I applied for alternative service, and I had to go to my draft board. And at that point, I was living in Berks County, about 40, 50 miles east of Lancaster. That's where my home was at that point. And the draft board there permitted me to go into alternative service. And I did that by serving with Mennonite voluntary service. It was a national Mennonite organization that it was like a Mennonite Peace Corps, so to speak. President Kennedy had started a Peace Corps here in the US right before that. And so I was responsible to administer programs in Central America in agricultural development. It was a Mennonite outreach, and each of these units had two boys in, Mennonite boys, conscientious objectors. They would be in different villages. And I saw for the first time in my life extreme poverty there. I would go and visit them as their supervisor, just extreme poverty. One image, Simon, it stays with me today. It's just amazing how a single image can stay in your mind so long. But I was out one day walking with a farmer up to his patch up on the hillside of vegetables. They would live in town and then walk out, you know, to their little plot that they had. And I saw his trousers were all patched together, pieces of worn out trouser covering holes sewn together. And he said, this is the only pair of trousers he has, the only pair. And they'd been repaired so many times. It was almost like quilt work on the trousers. But that image stayed with me and has influenced decisions I make about how I spend my money, decisions about what kind of things I feel I can afford, decisions about reminding me there are millions of people like him still today in the world. And so it was that's a powerful image, very emotive, as you can tell, for me, that still stays with me 50 years later.
So that time was obviously extremely important for you, that the time where you were doing the Mennonite voluntary service.
Yes, and it was also important because it's the first time I was outside of my Mennonite culture. Okay, I'd gone to public schools, but this was different because I was, for the first time, speaking a new language, interacting with people in a very different culture, and had to deal with some of my ethnocentrism that I was surprised about. When we got down, their practice there in the culture was to take a siesta every day from 12 to 2. And I was with a group of, this was a short-term visit to Honduras before I got into voluntary service, but it led to that. And this is crazy. These people are lazy. What's wrong with them? We work all day, we start early, work all day. And boy, I'll tell you, after 2 or 3 days of that hot, very hot, humid weather, you were to take a siesta too.
Siesta's always rather attractive, I think. So,
yes.
Can we explore that a bit more? I mean, the sense of confinement. In one sense, you've obviously got this very rich body you live in, but just reading it felt, you work close to where you were born. You went to a local school. You went to a local college. Do you feel you ventured out from the Mennonite world, or do you feel that mostly you've remained in it?
I would say that in terms of that's a complicated question. In terms of my closest friends, would still be in the Anabaptist world. My Anabaptist connections are fairly broad. I mean, I was a provost at Messiah College, which is Brethren in Christ. That's another group that they emerged in the 1770s here in the United States. But anyway, so I have contacts there. I have a lot of Amish friends. I have Church of the Brethren friends. We are members of the Church of the Brethren here at Elizabethtown. And so my friends are there. I have Mennonite friends. I feel like I have rich, in terms of personal friendship, rich connections within still an Anabaptist world. But I have so many other friendships through my research and writings. I mean, from people in other traditions, non-religious people who are just interested in the Amish, but not in their spirituality, more their culture. So I live in sort of two different worlds in a sense. And then I would say the third one would be the academic world that I live in terms of what I read and so on. But in terms of my closest friends, if I would identify my, let's say, 15 closest friends, they would be within the Anabaptist world.
Right. Okay. Because again, this is quite, I think when we come on to the Upside Down Kingdom, that's something I'd like to explore a bit. But before that, I've just, while you were doing the Mennonite voluntary service, you were also a pastor of a church. And how did that work? What sort of church was it? Because you were a young man then.
Yes. When I came back, I graduated in 1967 from Eastern Mennonite University. And I came back to Lancaster, and I was married in my senior year of university. So we came back and went to my wife's home church, which was known as the Willow Street Mennonite Church. Willow Street is a little town south of Lancaster. This would be 40 miles from my home in Mount Joy, Elizabethtown. We went to that congregation. And they had, they would have had maybe they would have had 50 or 60 families there, and attendance on a Sunday morning of 175 or something. And so we went there, and the senior pastor was getting older, and he asked for assistance. And so the plan was to have an ordination which used a lot. And at that point, Mennonite churches in Lancaster would use a lot. It's like the biblical lot that would have been used. It's referenced in the Old Testament, where it's a kind of a lottery, but it has spiritual significance, religious significance. And so people would nominate people to go into the lot. And then if there were 5 or 6 in the lot, then each of them would be given a Bible and a songbook, and one of the songbooks would have a slip of paper in it. And if you pulled that, you were ordained. And I didn't really believe in that anymore. I mean, I was on the cutting edge because that was still being done in most of the churches. And so I wasn't sure, like, can I go through with this? I mean, okay, let me back up and say the congregation nominated 2 people. I was one of them, and there was another older man. I mean, I was just 25 or so at that point. And this other man would have been maybe 35 or 40. And we were both nominated. So I didn't know quite what to do. And so while I was trying to decide if I wanted to go forward with the lot, he pulled back because of his wife's health and said he didn't feel he could go through. So subsequently then I was ordained without going through the lot. So it was an interesting thing. The other second thing that's interesting is I was the first person in the whole Lancaster conference, this would have been maybe 200 congregations, ordained who wasn't required to wear a special plain coat. It would have been it's a coat that people sometimes, the Beatles would dress sort of that way. It's a cut off, and adult men in the church, my father wore one of those. Everybody did, regardless of men. But at that point, some of the men were not wearing them as much, but the ministers still had to. And I said that I wasn't comfortable doing it. And it put my bishop, who I would have been my supervisor, in a bind because I was working at the voluntary service office at that point. And so the bishop board would meet there occasionally with the larger mission board, and all of his peers would come. And so he said, well, how could we work out a compromise? How about if you don't have to wear it when you preach at Willow Street, but if you come to Salunga and there are big meetings where my colleagues are coming, would you please wear it there out of deference to me? So I did.
It's interesting, isn't it?
But I was the first. I was the first person that wasn't required to wear it in all these churches. So, but it was sort of quiet. But he didn't want that public display. So I did him a favor.
And I mean, you've got here Anabaptists who stood absolutely for not having a clergy, in effect, just growing into traditions of clergy.
Yes, exactly.
And that's as a sociologist.
Excuse me?
As a sociologist, did you feel that?
Yes. Well, you feel what I would always be I often felt a sense of tension between the early Anabaptists who were meeting out in farms and in caves and suffering persecution, but didn't have a well-established church, and then all the institutional forms and rituals that had emerged within the Mennonite community that I grew up with. And so this wearing the suit was a new thing. It actually, there were no requirements like this in the late 19th century. This came in the 1920s, and it came from the Midwest, and it was a way to symbolize separation from the world, the suit. The women had to wore a prayer covering. And so when you'd see a Mennonite couple out in their Sunday dress, you'd see the man like this, and it was a sharp, stark symbol of separation from the world. But then in addition, you had church structures that, I mean, as human beings, we build structures. The Berger would say, we construct these human relationships and structures and buildings and arrangements. But then we serve them eventually. We build them, but then we become the products of them, and we internalize them. And so, yeah, that's But I would say it's not a unique Mennonite problem. It's a human problem.
Yes. We're definitely going to
Yes.
explore that a little bit more, Don. Can we just carry on exploring you when you were a pastor? I remember vividly when you were teaching me, you said when you preached and you mentioned the blood of Christ,
Okay.
you got much more of a response from the congregation. They would say, "Very good sermon, Pastor," or something, or at the end. How did you enjoy the church?
Well, did I join the church?
No, did you enjoy being a pastor?
Yeah, well, I'll be happy to talk about that a little bit. Yes, so I'm this young 27-year-old that's ordained, the one thing that was so fascinating to me was that the older pastor who was there, we would alternate Sundays. Every other Sunday I would preach, every other Sunday. And every Sunday he preached, he had been influenced by the fundamentalist movement in the United States. And he would use a Schofield Bible. I don't know, familiar with that. It's a Bible with a lot of footnotes in it that tries to divide holy history into different time periods. And it imposes a kind of pseudo-scientific view of the scripture and God's planning over time. But it's very fundamentalistic, very non-Anabaptist, but that's what he was reading. He had been influenced by that. So every Sunday he'd preach from Paul's epistles. He'd preach from the Romans, and he'd always be preaching on salvation by grace and grace alone. I would always preach from the Gospels, from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, especially from the Synoptic Gospels. And the congregation picked up on it, and they said, well, we have the best of both worlds. That way, one Sunday we get a message from the Gospels, and next Sunday from Paul and Pauline epistles and so on. So it was very telling, though, what, for me, the prime authority within the scriptures, and I would say this would have been an Anabaptist orientation, is our hermeneutic is Christocentric, that we look to the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Pauline epistles, through the mind and eyes of Christ. His hermeneutic was more the focus on the salvation story that developed theologically, and so you had those two different views. And yes, if I would talk about the blood of Christ, that was central. See, it's central to the sacrificial motif of the cross. That somehow God was so angry with his people that he had to kill his son in order to go through this sacrificial rite that would appease this angry God. So I was never comfortable with that motif, but that's what the blood meant to them. And that's why if I would mention the blood, they'd like the sermon much better than if I didn't mention the sacrifice and the sacrificial blood. The other issue for me was later, I've served as pastor about 5 years. And then when we moved to Elizabethtown, then I had to resign. But I was starting graduate work at that time, and I was reading Marx and Durkheim and Weber, and I'd be on the train, taking this 2-hour train ride to Philadelphia, reading this stuff, and then coming back, and needing to preach Sunday morning with integrity. And I was just, at that point, trying to find my way intellectually, and it was really, it was hard for me to preach with integrity. And to be very honest about where I was, and I didn't know where it was going to end up, but it was a complicated, lot of cognitive dissonance.
I've always found sociology both fascinating and helpful, but incredibly difficult in terms of faith, or certainly some aspects of it. Now, you'd started your PhD, and can you just talk a bit more about how you dealt with these tensions, because they're clearly there.
Right. Yeah. Let me tell you a story first from my doctoral program, which maybe, well, anyway, I find it interesting in retrospect. So I'm in this doctoral program. I have to do 2 years of courses, and then eventually can work on my dissertation. And I discovered I was hanging out with maybe 5 or 6 friends. We would study together. And I realized one day, these, I stepped back from this, and all of my friends were either Jewish or African American. And there were no white English people. I mean, yeah, there were they were Jewish or they were African American. There were no Protestants there, no Methodists, no Baptist. It's kind of like, well, what? And then I realized, I know we all are outsiders. And I have the Martyr's Mirror, this 1,200-page book with pictures in of my people historically that were burned at the stake, decapitated. I have the Martyr's Mirror. Slaves in the United States have slavery, and the Jews have the Holocaust. And I don't mean to put those three things on equal basis, but all of those events, the offspring of those events, create people who are somewhat alien in the larger world. They feel they're not at home, that the man may come to get them again at some point. And so I felt like an outsider, but I had this camaraderie with Jews and African Americans. It was just fascinating. So, yeah, my journey in graduate school, excuse me, I felt this tension all the time, and in some ways it got worse when I began reading Peter Berger. And I read Berger during this time, and particularly his social construction of reality. It's a tiny little book. I think it comes out in 64, 65 or something. It's just a tiny little thing. But I probably reread it more than any other book apart from the Bible. And it really shaped my thinking and way of thinking of things that has stayed with me to the present. He also was interested in modernity and social change. He has an excellent book that also was influential, The Homeless Mind. And see, I'm struggling with modernity as a Mennonite farm boy down at the university. I mean, I come out of this, and what's happening in the Mennonite world is modernization. We're having tractors instead of horses. Some had television, on and on. I mean, and so modernity and how to deal with modernity was my issue as well. And so I had this affinity with Berger. And so he was a person of faith. He says on a number of occasions he's a Christian, and so there was always this sense of affinity with him. And I would say, Simon, he has probably been my most important mentor. And I had a conversation with him for 2 minutes in the city of Cincinnati, Ohio, at a sociological conference in an elevator. He was inside the elevator. We're going up to the, meeting rooms up higher. And I went in and I looked at, I said, "You're Peter Berger?" He said, yes, I am. Who are you? And we had this lovely 2-minute conversation. But I would say he has been an important intellectual mentor for me in many ways. And the basic argument of this little book is in some ways it's simple, but in other ways profound. It's like, humans need meaning. We need to make sense out of things. And so we construct beliefs. We construct our belief about Santa Claus. This is, I don't know if you have a Santa Claus over there or not, but that is a belief that was constructed. We have beliefs about Easter bunnies, and they become objectified. You see Christmas cards with them on. People expect gifts that Santa Claus brings, and they're not only objectified out there, then they become internalized, that the child says, well, I want my Santa Claus gift. I mean, society comes inside us, and those beliefs and structures that we have constructed over time, over centuries, that are now objectified also become internalized inside us. And so an example I often use is, a mother takes her child to the checkout counter in the grocery store, and the grocery store, the clerk there gives the child a lollipop. And the mother says, now, what do you say? What do you say? She keeps repeating this every time they come through to the child. And so after a while, the child automatically says, thank you. So that ritual or that rite from the society is now internalized in the thinking of the child. So the child feels coerced by culture, so to speak, to say that every time, and feels like they're being shameful or impolite if they don't say it. It's a tiny little thing, Simon, a tiny little ritual, but it applies to all the other things that we do as well that become internalized. Yes. Well, maybe that's on Peter Berger.
And it's when you go abroad and you suddenly discover people don't say thank you in the same way. But Brits coming to America find that, certainly. So I'd just like to carry on with the Peter Berger. I mean, I've always been quite influenced by particularly his book, A Rumour of Angels, and his idea that knowledge is socially constructed and it's less about truth and more about plausibility, which I've always found very helpful, if nothing else, for showing the importance of staying within a Christian community to maintain beliefs.
Yeah. No, I think the distinction between knowledge and truth is very important, and I think that little book, was very helpful. In fact, it's interesting if you read the introduction to it. He's struggling with this stuff himself. He said, "This is my answer to it, how I work through it." I would say the other thing. Because and some of this, there's a bridge here between Berger and the Upside Down Kingdom. I don't know when you want to go there or not, but
in a second, yes. Please carry on. Do carry on, Don.
What I was going to say is, so when you first work through Berger, you're thinking, well, all these beliefs, about everything we think about God is socially constructed. It's kind of like, how do we envision God? What words do we use? How do we think of God? Does God intervene in the world and so on? And all of these things, Berger would say, are socially constructed. And so for me, it's sort of like pulled the rug out from under everything. It's like cutting off some of the pillars of my faith. And so when I got, after I was out of graduate school and teaching several years, after I had my dissertation finished, I wrote The Upside Down Kingdom, and I was writing it in 1976 and 77. It was published in 78. And I was really, for me, The Upside Down Kingdom was a way of addressing the Berger question for me, because it, as you know from the book, it's very Christocentric. It's a focus on Jesus. It's a focus on his teachings in Matthew and Luke especially. And for me, there was a truth there. I mean, Jesus, there's no doubt, scholars will agree, Jewish historians, everyone, there was a Jesus, a historical Jesus, a real Jesus. Yes, we have many different interpretations of him, but there's a core, historical core, that for me made it possible to anchor my faith on that historical core. And so I'm trying to work out my some of my cognitive dissonance between my faith and the relativism and the secular perspective. And I'm doing that with this sharp focus on Jesus. And I would say it also was very Anabaptist, because it was it's a focus on orthopraxis, and it's also raising the question of what does it mean to follow Jesus in daily life? And so that's what I'm doing, trying to work in the upside down kingdom, but I am bringing a sociological eye to the upside down, to the Gospels. And I think, I mean, the book has, as you may know, it was 40th anniversary edition was released about 2 years ago. And I'm just astonished it stays alive. And the audience is primarily 25-year-olds to 35-year-olds. They're at that stage of their life where they're trying to figure some of this stuff out. And so it's been very influential to that age group. But it's refreshing, I think, to some, because I have the sociological filters on, and I'm looking through the sociological lenses at the life of Jesus and the teaching to try to make sense out of that. And I think it's creative and fresh. And so the other thing is, I don't try to say, well, this is what you have to do. I just kind of like try to say, this is what the meaning of the story is in the context of Palestinian culture. And the basic argument of the book is the way of Jesus was upside down in Palestinian culture. It was radically countercultural in terms of the Palestinian and Hebrew and Jewish practices. It wasn't an attack on Jewish religion, but it was an attack on human concocted religious rituals and concocted practices that get in the way of love and compassion and empathy. I can go on all that's maybe enough.
No, and it's funny. I've been rereading the book to prepare for this interview, and it's both quite strange reading things that influenced me so strongly when I read it as a 25-year-old. Also, I'm a bit shocked to discover things which I thought were my idea actually turned out to be your idea. Particularly, I set up this organization, and everyone had equal pay. So, and I thought, and this was immensely powerful, and I did it very much from both a theological and a sociological point of view. And I thought this was all my ideas, and then I'm really annoyed to discover it's all in your book, and I'd so internalized it.
I think it's the idea from the early church in Acts. It wasn't my idea; it's original back then.
Yeah, but I think I got from you partly that sociology, an awareness of power and culture and symbols, which I think for me has gone with me, that the sense of making Jesus real. He was a real person in a real situation then, and we have to, in a sense, make him real in our lives now. The orthopraxis, which I find so powerful. So
wonderful. I'm so delighted to learn about your organization, and so happy to see it in practice. And I just applaud you and say amen, amen.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually moved on, and they then stopped equal pay after I left. I mean, so it stayed for 14 years, which I was rather sad. But it needs the top person to say, I'm going to have equal pay.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it doesn't work. So
yeah,
I found, I mean, yeah, I think with the Upside Down Kingdom, I think it's interesting what you say about 25 to 35-year-olds, because I can see my son has now been reading it, and he's quite influenced by it as well. So it obviously, that sense of challenge, I think, might appeal to that age group, particularly.
Yeah, and I think it just raises a lot of provocative questions, and I think by not answering them and saying, well, you should do this or you should do that, I just kind of like take you to the brink
Yes.
of the cliff to look and think. And
before we go on, maybe can you just explore that a bit more? That I suppose when I look back, one of the challenges I faced is a sort of slight parody. People have said, oh, well, maybe you're just a Christian social worker. And I do think that even though I don't think there should be, I think in practice, there is quite a tension between the sort of social action side and witness evangelism. And I'm not quite sure why that exists, but I think when I look back, that's an area I feel a bit comfortable about in my own career. And I just wonder what you feel about that as well.
I'm not quite sure what your the
I
difference
think
between
whether
justice.
we've been evangelistic enough as well.
Yeah. It's a hard question it's hard to find a good balance, I think. I know Mennonite Central Committee, which is a major international relief organization in maybe 50 or 60 countries, doing agriculture development, all kinds of stuff. They still say in the name of Christ. I mean, they aren't directly trying to evangelize, but they're branding it as Christian. I can tell a story, and I let me tell this Amish story. There was a tragic shooting in 2007 in Lancaster County, where a neighbor, a non-Amish man, came into an Amish schoolroom and shot 10 girls, execution style, into the back, and 5 of them died. But it was just horrific, and it was a worldwide thing, and you may have heard. But the Amish do not engage. They don't have formal missionary organizations or evangelistic organizations, and they've always said our life, the quality of our life, should be our witness. And so it was interesting. They had. I mean, there were 2,400 stories, 2,400, Simon, on international media, not about the shooting, but about Amish forgiveness. Because the Amish, within 6 hours, forgave the family. The man that did the shooting killed himself. But they went to his wife, to his parents, and said, we want you to stay here, live with us. We're not going to, retaliate. Somebody from your tribe did something bad to our tribe, but just that's clean. It's forgiveness, and that became a powerful story. I wrote a book about it. I've given dozens, if not hundreds, of lectures about it. But one of the Amish fathers said, "This is the way we witness. That this was a more powerful witness. This forgiveness." So hard to do when your child was killed that day, 6 or 7 hours later, to say, we forgive you, the family members. That was a more powerful witness, he said, than any tracts that we could have passed out or mission organizations that we could have set up and so on. I think, in some ways, to get back to your question, there's a sense in which what we do as Christians to serve the poor, to serve the needy, to work for social justice, there's a sense in which there are other people doing that as well who may not come from a Christian background. And that doesn't mean that what we're doing is wrong or that we shouldn't welcome them. I think, God's heart's big enough that God probably welcomes everyone showing empathy, engaged in justice, engaged in peacemaking. And everyone has a motivation or a reason. And I think it's appropriate for us to say that this comes from our Christian faith. This is what it means for us to be a Christian. In my local congregation, every Sunday morning, the pastors open a service by saying this: we welcome you to our congregation. Here we strive to practice peace, service, and openness to all. That means openness regardless of your gender, regardless of any stigmas that you might bring. But the focus is on practicing peace, service, and openness to all. And it's said again and again and again, and everybody knows it by memory. And to me, I'm happy to say that in the public square, that I'm here as a follower of Jesus Christ. I'm seeking to practice peace, service, and openness to all in the name of Jesus. It's hard for me to be aggressive with evangelism, but I feel like we do need to articulate it, articulate where we're coming from. Even if there are people beside us who are agnostic or atheists who are doing similar work. We all have different motivations, and I think it's important for us as Christians to name our identity and our motivation.
Yes, thank you. In a way, expanding this, and this may be more of a UK issue, but I'm also interested in just the whole relationship between church and state. I mean, clearly the Anabaptists have always taken a very strong view about the separation of church and state.
Right.
And here in the UK, there is much less clear distinction between the church and
Yes.
state. We have a state church.
Yes.
What do you feel about that?
I don't know. I'm aware of what you're saying. And I don't feel like I know enough about the life of churches and the freedom of churches and the encroachment of government there, or the arrangements. I don't feel I know enough to even comment on it.
Okay.
Say here, the sense of freedom of religion is embedded in our Constitution, and there are, and so, unless we are doing something in the name of religion that is destructive to the society, government will basically allow us to do it if it's sincerely held religious faith and not just something concocted, for the moment. But it's clear the government shouldn't align itself with the state, and that believers, there shouldn't be interference in terms of the First Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's used again. I mean, it's used a lot. And I would say there is a civil religion. The first book I wrote before the Upside Down was called our Star-Spangled Faith, which was a critique of civil religion in the United States. So when the president said, "God bless America," or "we pledge allegiance to one nation under God," I mean, that kind of God is not what we're talking about in the Judeo-Christian tradition. That is a civic God that is that has favored nations, and it's really idolatry of the nation to have that kind of civil religion. So my point is, in some ways, you could argue that it's in the human nature to knit these together, church and state together, that this civil religion tries to do that as well. So we have our own church and state combined, not legally, but in the culture, of singing "God Bless America." And in that book, I went through all the hymns, and I mean, it's heavy. And in local schools here, at one stage, you'd have the teacher early in the first thing in the morning. This is maybe a number of years ago, not now. They'd read several passages from the Bible and then pledge allegiance to the flag, one nation under God. So anyway, where I'm going with this is that there is this human tendency to want to bring things together. And your system may be working effectively. I don't know enough about it to make a reasonable comment.
Yeah, I suppose, it's interesting. An issue I've always had was whether we should take government money. And in the end, I compromised and took the money. But there's a cost always to that. Maybe moving on a bit.
we take money all the time. I mean, we have Medicare. I mean, the health. I mean, we have a lot of socialized programs here. Americans won't admit it, but there's a lot of socialized and money. I think you have to. The line would be whether at some point is there some obligation to do something in return, or is it anyway? I'm sorry. Yeah.
No. Can we move on to your academic career? So I guess we're in the sort of, you've produced the Upside Down Kingdom, and you then start as an academic. You do your PhD, and then you start.
No, I had done, that has all been done. I finished my PhD in 75. And then my first book was this, and I started teaching part-time in 71. I was teaching, doing my dissertation. So, but I was just kind of like hit and run teaching that. I mean, it was kind of like I was so busy. So the first, I would say, academic book would have been the Star-Spangled Faith in 76, then the Upside Down Kingdom. And so I'm teaching, and those are my first books. Then I do one on nuclear war, facing nuclear war. I don't have the whole list here, and then I get interested in the Amish in about 1985.
Okay, Don, I think you're going to have to tell us a little bit about the Amish, because as most Westerners, I expect, all we really know is Harrison Ford's film, The Witness, and and bits of it I think were accurate, but probably bits of it were terribly wrong as well.
Yeah, but actually, the Witness is important to talk about for two things. I'll comment on its accuracy, but it's also what got me started in Amish studies.
Oh, right, okay.
I actually I taught a seminar each year in the Amish on the Amish for many years, and after Witness was out, I used it in the seminar for my students. I mean, I would say it is very sensitive to Amish culture. I mean, there are little details that are wrong. The plot would never have happened. The plot doesn't, I mean, it's very unlikely that the Amish would put somebody up. I mean, the plot doesn't work, but the values of Amish society are treated with sensitivity. The famous imaging that I remember is when this detective who comes to the home, I mean, he was injured. He comes there and he has this pistol, and his wife or his girlfriend, his Amish girlfriend, sort of picks it up like this, like it's a dead fish, you know, and puts it over in a drawer, like it's evil and it's of the world, and she just touches it a little bit like it would be a stinking dead fish and puts it in a drawer. So my point, though, is that it's not a bad film. It actually captures, from the Amish perspective, captures Amish culture. I mean, the togetherness, the working together, and so on. But there was it was filmed here in Lancaster County, just 20 miles from where we're sitting today, where I'm sitting today. And there was a lot of controversy about it. Paramount came in, they wanted to hire Amish people to help them, and a few did, and then they were excommunicated from the church. And my advisor, John Hostetler at Temple, he asked if I would help him write an article on it. And then he wrote some articles he was much more critical of the film than I was. But that's what got me interested in what I would call the riddles of Amish culture. So I don't know, should I take that forward?
Please, but can I just make a comment here? I don't remember, but I visited you in your home and you drove me around Lancaster County. And I remember three things vividly. The first, which really surprised me, actually was 3 Mile Island. You were right near it. So
Yes.
Is literally hotbed of technology. So then the second was seeing an Amish farmer barefooted, which shocked me. And the third thing was you telling me there was a phone booth, and you said those phone booths were owned they were shared. And
Yes,
again,
yes.
that you said that some of the milking parlors had electricity. And
Yeah.
I can remember when you talk about the riddle of the Amish, I was sort of left feeling quite perplexed by this sort of poverty yet wealth, technology yet rejection of
Right.
technology, and then so all in the shadow of 3 Mile Island, which
Yeah. Yeah, well, 3 Mile Island, I must say, Simon, I forget taking you around. I had no idea
it
where
was
we,
just a day.
I mean, I get so many visitors and I'm sorry, but it just, it's a long time ago.
It's 35 years ago, Don.
How many?
35.
25. Okay. Um, I can talk about, I'm not sure if I should just pick up in the Amish thing here. I think maybe I can talk about 3 Mile Island. I mean,
Well,
it
we'll talk
was,
about the Amish.
okay. Yeah. Uh, so, um, So at that point, I'm looking for a research area. This is 1985. And so I'm thinking, I'm realizing that in my Mennonite family, we always look down on the Amish. It's like they're relics from the 19th century. They're still using horses. This would have been, let's say, when I was 10 years old, 1955. You know, they don't use electricity. They're just going to die out soon. There were some scholars predicting their demise shortly. I remember when my grandfather was buried, a Mennonite preacher, we grandchildren wanted to take turns at the grave shoveling some ground over the casket, which we did. But one of my uncles said, "Well, that's an old Amish way of doing it," with disgust. You know, it's kind of like we're better than they are. We're more modern. Our eyes are open and our lights are on, and so on. So, but anyway, so the Amish had these riddles that I was perplexed about. It's kind of like you aren't allowed to own. This is now 1985. You're not allowed to own a car, but you can hire a local driver. You can ride one. It's like they out Ubered Uber. They started doing this in 1920. So you're allowed to ride, but you can't own it. Well, that sounds hypocritical. Um, you're allowed to use electricity from batteries, but not from the public utility line. Well, how can that be? It's just like electric is electric. It's kind of like, what's the problem here? You're not allowed to go to high school, but you're allowed to go into business, and on and on. The telephone, they didn't want telephones in the house. Well, you can have one out in the shanty. You have to walk out there. It all seemed, and other people would say it was hypocritical. It was contradictory. It just didn't make sense. So that was the intrigue that got me into Amish studies. And again, the Berger issue comes up in Homeless Mind. It's kind of like the Amish are dealing with modernity. And the basic argument that I have made in that first book, The Riddles of Amish Culture, back in it would have been 1989, I think, when it came out. The basic argument, and I still defend the argument to today, is that the Amish were negotiating with modernity. They were negotiating with modernity. What do I mean by that? I mean that some things they rejected outright, like television. You know, you cannot have a television. You shouldn't be watching television. They rejected that. Other things they accepted, like barbecue gas grills to barbecue meat on, no problem. State-of-the-art tools, hand tools, powered by a battery, no problem. So you have them accepting some things, rejecting other things. And then third, they're bargaining with modernity. They're negotiating and bargaining with what they will change. And some of the things they Amish-ize. One Amishman said to me, well, I have to Amish-ize this food processor because it has an electric motor in. It came that way when we bought it. And I have to put an air motor in it. And I can operate it by air, but not electric. And that would be an example of bargaining where they're using the modern technology, but adapting it to fit their culture. And then others would be like with the car, what they're doing is restricting the car to a certain extent, but yet allowing some use of it for business people, and they travel on vans maybe to a funeral or a wedding out of the area. And so they're making all these bargains, which look silly to us on the outside, look hypocritical to us, but they make sense internally. It's like, where to draw the line between being in the world but not of the world, what to use in modern life and what to reject. And so you have all these interesting bargains, which I found just fascinating, and they continue today.
Could you talk about mobile phones? Because about mobile phones, cell phones, because I gather that's a key area for bargaining at the minute.
Well, right now, I would say that is the hottest debate in Amish country with the smartphone. They started using, and by the way, the Amish, just a little context here, they are in 31 states, and they have over 500 geographical settlements and over 2,500 local congregations. And each local congregation, has the authority to determine its rules and regulations as it pertains to technology, for example. And so as I speak about the mobile phone and then what we would call the smartphones, it's impossible to talk about the Amish in totality. There is no centralized Amish authority. There's not a central Amish Pope. There's not a national headquarters. There's no national bureaucracy. And these are things they rejected of modernity. Think about this, Simon. No bureaucracy as we're 2 decades into the 21st century. Still no bureaucracy. It's phenomenal. I mean, bureaucracy was a huge development in North America, at least in the 20th century. So anyway, decisions about mobile phones and smartphones are made at the individual church level, at the congregational level. So the mobile phones, these are like the flip lid phones, came out like in the late 90s. And a few Amish people in the early 2000s started getting them, but they kind of hid them. And, you could turn them off. And so nobody knew you had it. And so eventually a number of them did. And so now it's not unusual in some church districts or congregations to have the flip lid. The more, in my mind, dangerous issue is the smartphone. A cardinal principle of the Amish since their origin is separation from the world. Separation from the world. And they would go to various scriptures that says, where the scripture would say, love not the world, or the things that are into the world, be not conformed to the world, and so on. And so many of the decisions they make reflect that underlying theological principle, whether you could go and see movies or not, whether you have a car, all kinds of things. They would use that religious principle or basic to make that decision. So here now with a smartphone, the world, the entire world, with all its virtues and vices, with all its love and malice, with all its pornography and beauty, are in the hands of an Amish teenager. The whole world's in their hands. So how do you begin to maintain separation from the world when the world is in your pocket, so to speak? And so it's a very complicated discussion, a very difficult one at this stage. Excuse me again. The people most likely to have a smartphone are business people who maybe would use it to order parts, because they also keep computers at arm's length. Sometimes a neighbor may provide computing service, but they tend to, in more progressive settlements, the business owners would often have a smartphone. There are other Amish groups or tribes, as I call them, very conservative. who won't even make a phone call at a public place. They would go to a neighbor and ask the neighbor to place the call on the neighbor's phone because they don't even want to touch the phone. I mean, that's the ultra conservative. Okay. So you have a huge spectrum, and it's going to remain zigzag for many years because there's no centralized authority that can make a decision about it.
Don, I've just really got a little bit more to explore about this, I think. Can we talk a little bit about the dark side of the sort of Anabaptists, and maybe start with the sort of Bergholz Barber's case?
Okay.
And I was struck by Mennonites. Well, the Anabaptist tradition is this peacemaking tradition, kind, forgiving. But when people got angry, they could get very angry. And I was struck by this when I was in seminary. There were stories people told about pastors having all their stuff thrown out on the streets. And we've got right the way back to the early days of Anabaptism with the Munster period.
Yes, yes.
And I just wonder if you'd sort of comment that there is this sort of shadow side, I think, to Anabaptism that seems to lurk there a bit.
Yeah. Well, you're correct about Munster. This was where the Anabaptist very radical, apocalyptic Anabaptists took over the city of Munster and, were forcing people to be baptized. It's a very sad chapter. And unfortunately, I would say in some ways it was an isolated situation, but it influenced the interpretation of Protestant theologians of who the Anabaptists were up until the middle of the 20th century. So it's a very dark, bad stain. And there were there were other examples of some non-peaceful Anabaptists in the early years. Because it was a widespread movement. I can only say that. Well, let me say two things. Anabaptists are humans. And regardless, the culture provides some mediating influence. If you're born into an Anabaptist culture, you have mediating influences there to direct you in the way of peacemaking and love and so on. But you have people who also have strong egos and who work out, take advantage of other people sometimes, and so that happens.
Well, maybe just talk about the. Could you mention about the Bergholz Barbers? Because I know you were influenced by that, and there's quite a lot of fascinating modern issues around hate crime and the role of the state.
Yes. Yeah.
Could you explain first of all just what it was?
Yeah. So in 2011, there was a very odd thing that happened in the state of Ohio, where a Amish bishop began sending some of his members of his church. And remember, his church is a congregation that has maybe 25 families in it and their children. So it might be 200 people, but just maybe 25 families. He sends some of his people, this Amish bishop, out to cut the hair and cut the beards at night of other Amish bishops to retaliate against them. This bishop, I'm slipping on his last name, Sam, we'll just call him Sam. His first name is Sam. So Sam was a renegade bishop. So this is it was a very odd situation because this was really a renegade bishop. Half of the members of his congregation were his own family, like his children and relatives. And he moved out of a stable Amish settlement to an isolated one. He was the only congregation in that area of Eastern Ohio. It was in hill country. And he wasn't ordained when he went there, and he sort of rigged the election to become ordained a minister and a bishop. And his theology was very non-Amish in that he said that he is a prophet from God. He had pictures drawn where, showed that he was one of the Old Testament prophets, so that God spoke through him, and that in the Old Testament you could use violence, so it legitimates him using violence. So it was an utter aberration of Amish church life. They stopped having services after a while, and it basically became a cult because he had authority over everyone, and yet they dressed Amish, and they still spoke Pennsylvania Dutch, and they called themselves Amish. Eventually, it led to a number of arrests by the FBI, and the federal prosecutor in Cleveland, in Ohio, charged him with hate crimes. And this was the most ironic thing, because it was the first time in history there was a new hate crime law. I forget I think it may have been passed in 2008 or 9 under the Obama administration. And they were charged with that law, and it was the first group charged with religious hate crimes inside their own group. And so it was just profound ironies. I worked with the U.S. Department of Justice in developing the prosecution to provide them information about Amish practices. And then I testified at the trial. It was a 3-week trial, and they were all out of all but 2 or 3 of the counts, they were found guilty. And then a number of them went to prison. Sam, the bishop, Mullet is his last name, Sam Mullet, just recently got out of prison because of COVID, the pandemic, the virus, because he's about 76, and they thought he might die in prison, so they were releasing him and other prisoners. So it's a sad story. It's a weird story. 300 of his fellow elders, bishops and ministers, unanimously voted to not honor his excommunications and so on. And that's what made him so angry, that all his fellow bishops, unanimously, 300 of them, took action against him. Then that's when what got him started with retaliating. It's a sad story. It's interesting, but it's sad, and it's an aberration of Amish life. In the book, I list like 22 reasons why they're not Amish, even though they purported to still be Amish, but they certainly weren't practicing Amish faith.
Could I just explore a little bit about what it says about the sort of both about hate crimes and about church and state? I mean, I was shocked to read that he got 15-year sentence, which seems a really, I know it was reduced a bit later on, but that seems a ridiculously long sentence. And it seems ironic that the Amish, in some sense, were being protected by the state, which they try and withdraw from, being protected by an armed police force and things like that. What's your feeling about these ironies now?
Well, I don't understand. You said that the Amish were being protected by the state. You mean the regular Amish, the normal Amish?
Oh, yes, the people who were the bishops who had their hair and beards shaved, they're in a sense being protected by the state.
Well, let me tell you, it was a struggle. This is a really interesting sidebar. The lead Amish bishop, sort of the most senior Amish bishop, that was part of the 300 that voted to condemn Sam Mullet. There were 3 or 4 senior bishops that wrote a statement about this that the people, all their colleagues agreed to. And he was asked by the federal investigators to come to the trial, the 3-week trial, and testify against Sam Mullet, the renegade. And I went to visit this Hirschberger, this other bishop, and I spent 2 days with him, stayed overnight in his house. And he said, Don, he said, I just don't know what to do. He said, they want me to come and speak at the trial. And I knew that. That's why I had gone there, because I was slated to be the expert witness on the Amish. He said, I don't feel like I can go because it's, he said, we don't go to the court to settle our disputes. And he said, if I go, I'm using force again. It's Jesus said we should love our enemies and we shouldn't use force. And he said, I've preached all these years that we shouldn't use force. I've told the young people before they're baptized that, peacemaking and not using force is one of the ways of Jesus. And he said, I just can't go. He said, look what Jesus went through. He said, I just got a haircut in the middle of the night. Jesus was hung on a cross and died. And he didn't retaliate. He didn't respond. He didn't press charges. So why should I go and press charges with just a little thing like getting my hair cut at night? And he was struggling with this as I was there. I mean, I didn't know what was going to be the outcome. Eventually, some of his other bishop colleagues said, well, why don't you just go and tell the truth? That's not pressing charges. Just tell the truth of what happened. Explain, answer their questions about what happened. And that may prevent some other people from being hurt, because Sam Mullet, the other people were really afraid if he didn't go to prison, he'd come out and hurt people, continue his kind of aggressive, malicious activities. Mm-hmm. So finally, Hirschberger agreed to do that. And it was interesting. He spoke after I spoke. I was on the witness stand for 6 hours, 3 hours, 2 different days. And they had 15 defense attorneys, 15. And it's kind of, talk about being in a minefield. You don't know what, and it was the most interesting but taxing, one of the most taxing days of my life. Mm-hmm. But he came and he answered their questions very politely, and explained what happened. But it was interesting. He was struggling with this, even to go and be a witness. He worried was like pressing charges and using force against an enemy. And that would get back, he also talked about the martyr's mirror. He said, these people, they're getting burned at the stake and they extend forgiveness. So, he wanted to be forgiving, even though this man, Sam Mullet, had shamed Amish around the world and their reputation. It was just fascinating to see Hirschberger struggling with this dilemma for him. And, for me, the takeaway line was, well, I only got a haircut. Jesus got crucified on a cross. But think of it theologically, Simon. See, Jesus is his example. He doesn't go to a creed to work his way through this. He's like, Jesus is my example for how I should live. And I do this if I just got a haircut.
I just push a little bit more about the whole relationship between church and state, because it seems to me, I was watching the attack on Congress day before yesterday, and there were people there with banners saying Jesus saves on it, which is a bit despairing in some ways. And again, I just wonder how you view, from an Anabaptist perspective, you can see people who are Christians taking these political positions. How do you find yourself?
To be very honest, I think the American mainstream evangelical community has gone to bed with the devil. And it's very tragic and very sad, because I think they, and now when I say they, I'm talking about more right-wing evangelicals who've been very supportive of Trump, Mike Pence being number one. They had a cultural agenda that they thought, and in many ways was true, that Trump was doing for them. So they were willing to, they theologically, they viewed him as being ordained of God, that God, brought him, and they'll cite Old Testament cases where, a king was brought up or brought down by God. And so if you believe that Trump was really ordained by God to help achieve, even though he's not a Christian, to achieve some of these cultural goals, they were willing to go to bed with the devil. I don't know quite how else to say it. But from my own little town of Elizabethtown, we had 4 or 5 buses of people from here that went down to Washington, 2.5 hours away, and were part of this march.
Wow.
And I've talked with a number of them just to try to understand theologically what's going on in their mind. They feel like American culture has gone in a secular direction. And this would include on issues like abortion, on gay rights, and so on. And they saw, and I don't know that it's changing too much, because some of these people were just interviewed yesterday. It was their stories in the newspaper, local people who said, we aren't being heard. Trump is the only person that would listen to us. And he, was doing good things for us, despite his despicable moral behavior of lying and lying and lying. And I think it has been a sad day. I'm saying the last 4 years have been a sad day for evangelicals in America, because the word evangelical has been tarnished, Simon, tarnished by Trump's malicious behavior. So I'm reluctant in a public way. I would be reluctant to identify as an evangelical, just because it now is mired and stained by the Trump imprint. But this gets me back to sociology. What is powerful for me with a sociological imagination is the importance of empathy and understanding how people make sense out of their world and develop meaningful belief systems. And so for me as a sociologist, rather than to condemn these people, I need to get into their world and mind and see how is it possible for them to carry a Jesus saved signs? I saw a lot of them down there on the media. And I suspect, I don't know, but if I had to guess, at least half of those people would identify themselves as Christians, as evangelical Christians. And they are there to support overthrowing the election because they think God's will resides with Trump. And a Democratic president and all the people he'll bring to office, they view as evil and working against the will of God. And so it's an example of the need, for me at least, of empathy to understand how they got to that place. And also not to be self-righteous myself, because I'm in a little world that's been created that's meaningful to me. But as Berger says, you can do a burger on a burger. My world is socially constructed. What I believe and think has been socially constructed and is legitimated by the networks that I'm in. So that leads me to two key words in sociology and I think in Christian faith, and that is empathy and humility. Empathy, to take seriously what other people are saying and understand what it would be like to be in their shoes. We have a saying here, to walk in their moccasins. What is it like to be in there? How did they get in there? And to realize that I am also in a web of meaning that has been spun by the spiders around me, and to have a sense of humility about that. So it's, to balance those two things. I think those two values for me are central to the way of Jesus, and central, at least the kind of sociology I do in cultural sociology, are pretty central for cultural sociology.
Thank you, Don. I think that's getting near the end, but I think there's an obvious question to ask you now is, what are you doing next? You say you're retired, but obviously not very retired.
Well, I just finished up a little book on what the Amish taught me. It's 22 short essays on what I learned from the Amish and what they taught me. And humility would be, would be one of those lessons. Forgiveness, another one. And then I also talk about their technology. So that Johns Hopkins is going to be publishing that in the fall of this year. So, but the writing part of it's finished. And, I think some of my children are saying that I need to spend some time writing some family history and also writing down my own history a bit that are in bits and pieces here and there that they don't really know. So I think I might, I feel an obligation to the family and also just interesting myself to put the pieces of my own autobiographical puzzle together. But I'm not sure that'll be worth publishing, but it's at least sort of my next calling at this point. So,
well, this conversation has been really good at hearing some of your story, and I hope you do put it down on paper, Don. And it's been I've really enjoyed meeting you and talking and hearing where you are now.
It's been a distinct honor for me to be part of this interview, Simon, and I'm so grateful for your interest in the book, and I'm just amazed how the book played, The Upside Down Kingdom played a significant role in your life and thinking, and I'm very grateful and wish you all the best, and maybe we can stay in touch.
Yeah, I hope so. Certainly not another 35 years. Lovely talking. Bye-bye then, Don.
Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.